Want to welcome to the program economist Nathan Tankus, author of the Notes on the Crisis newsletter. Nathan, welcome back to the show.
Always a pleasure to be here.
All right, I want to start with a piece you wrote yesterday. I guess it is. I'm looking at the date. And because we run into this all the time too. And this notion, because sometimes I think it's very hard for people to really understand how incompetent politicians can sometimes be. I mean, honestly, I've used this example many times before, but back in the days when we were at Air America, which was the radio network, people would send us emails saying like, we think there's a mole working in your place because, and I thought like, this is actually not an irrational reaction to have because I'm inside this building and it's hard for me to believe the level of incompetence I'm witnessing. And I can't help but think that that's what's going on here. And you wrote a piece yesterday dealing with that. Let's just start with that when we're talking about the debt ceiling, your assessment of like why we are watching this like slow motion debacle happen coming out of the White House.
Yeah, I mean, there's many different places that you can start, but I think one key place to just start is Biden himself. So much of what Biden has come with into his administration, for good and for ill, has been his quote unquote lessons that he's taken from having a first-hand witness to what was going on in the Obama administration. And in one example, that was good. He was absolutely convinced that we should just get out of Afghanistan. That was the last thing he'd really thought about that subject. And he just had stuck with that and got out despite the chattering classes all screaming against it. So in that example, it was good. In the debt ceiling example, it's not so good. So the last time he paid attention, 2011, that was seen as, didn't go well in a certain sense, although there was political advantage in the idea of that somehow that had some relation to Obama getting elected. I'll get back to that. But then in 2013, after Obama wins, the Republicans are weakened. The sort of like Tea Party energy wave is in a complicated, different place. And Biden looks at that, remembers that period, and thinks, well, the debt ceiling increases then were mostly clean debt ceiling increases. There was like a little bit of like putting congressmen's wages into escrow, congresspeople's wages into escrow. There was a little bit of like, let's create a bipartisan conference on the debt, blah, blah, blah. But for the most part, they did not successfully use the debt ceiling as a chip to get cuts. That wasn't what they were able to do with it, and other things were going on, like the government shutdown. But they weren't able to use the debt ceiling as this big hostage speech in 2013, and so that's the last time Biden's really thought about these issues. So Biden's thought is, well, let's just do 2013 again, and that's where this idea of not doing any negotiations come from. If we just say we won't negotiate, that's a position of strength. They'll fold over like they did in 2013. And that's really the core issue is this, that we're in a very different political situation, that Trump happens, that the transformation of the Republican Party under Trump, and that Republicans don't feel weak the way they did in 2013. And also you didn't have very different style of Republicans who could more readily cede to business pressure, and there was business pressure to cede to. That was fundamentally what our core problem is it's a playbook that has not paid attention to how the terrain has changed.
And they thought that McCarthy wouldn't be able to get that cut, save, and whatever bill, his budget bill. They thought he wasn't going to be able to pass that, and they seemingly had absolutely no concept that we might need a plan B. And so we hear, and you make this argument that it is really just it's a failure of strategy, it's a failure of competence, or however you want to characterize that. but it's not some type of secret way of introducing austerity, because this would be the stupidest way to possibly do it, it seems to me. Like, they don't get any political value out of it. They don't get any political cover, and it's not an effective way of austerity. It's just incompetence.
Well, there is a way. I mean, my story, I would say, is a mixture of incompetence and maliciousness, because there is a piece of it that is malicious, that is dangerous, which is starting the game of chicken itself. And you start the game of chicken by saying these unilateral options are so terrible, we can't do them, because if a unilateral option is viable, then it gives you, quote unquote, too much negotiating leverage. And thus, there's no possibility of coming together to do a deal. You might actually be forced to do one of your unilateral options. And from their point of view, they think that was the political loser. So the idea is always that bipartisanship is supposed to be the political winner, that there is some big audience among American voters for bipartisanship that will then show your seriousness and realness and all of that. So there is malicious in the sense that they are telling stories, they are lying about unilateral options in order to get a game of chicken. And they're fine with doing some cuts to get there. If they ultimately at the end get a little bit of cuts and some there that that ultimately gets the deal, they'll do that, and they don't care about who gets hurt from that. What hasn't worked out is that they screwed up the game of chicken. They thought that they could get a game of chicken, they'd get a deal, there'd be a little bit of cuts, and they would look, and then like that would make the Republicans look bad, that would make them look good. Things would work out. Instead, the Republicans are just not interested in negotiating. The Republicans are saying, they literally, I mean, Matt Gaetz said it yesterday. People, the people in their caucus don't feel like, quote, negotiating with their hostage. Let's play this clip for a second, because I have some questions as to who the hostage is here that he's referring to, because it could be like a half a dozen different options as to who that might be. Here's that clip.
Pulling it up.
We're pulling it up.
Yeah.
All right. Forget the point is do we have it?
Yeah. We
All right, let's just read the clip. We don't need the clip.
No, we got it right here. We got it. So this is a Semaphore reporter, Joseph Zabalos-Roig, essentially speaking to Matt Gaetz.
Would you say that the conservatives like yourself are becoming more pessimistic about the state of negotiations if, there's a bipartisan deal in sight maybe? Or how would you characterize the mood among your conservative colleagues right now?
I think my conservative colleagues, for the most part, support limit, save, grow, and they don't feel like we should negotiate with our hostage.
Okay, who is the hostage? What is it? Is it Kevin McCarthy?
I mean, it could be. I mean, I interpret it, and I think this is straightforward, that the hostage is Biden. That the hostage is the Biden administration.
Is it the economy? Is it the economy broadly?
I mean, that's another, the economy as well as the hostage. But I think fundamentally, it's Biden. They feel like they have him trapped, and they're right, because the Biden administration is doing everything possible to talk down the unilateral options, to get a negotiation, to force Republicans to the table to accept a deal with cuts. And the Biden administration has given up any leverage, and it's just said, this is us. This is our issue. We're screwed.
Wink, wink. We should all just do this. And the Republicans are basically saying, well, it looks like we don't just have to do this. They're now asking for going beyond grow, limit, save, or whatever the name of that bill is. And they're asking for more money for the military. So, they're just, and this has happened to Biden before in the past, where he tries to give up everything and they just won't take yes for an answer. And so let's talk about and I want to get into the two sort of like unilateral things that you've argued. One, of course, is mint the coin. The other is just the 14th Amendment. But the premise, it seems to me, of both those unilateral actions is, how is Joe Biden, and there's a court case almost around to this effect. I don't know if it hits it directly on that matter in Boston, but Joe Biden, how can he stay within his constitutional parameters and not employ a unilateral mechanism to go through the debt ceiling? Because he doesn't have the constitutional authority to appropriate or to tax. That is Congress's. And he doesn't have the universal authority to have a line item veto. That's already been shown to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So he can't not do the spending that Congress has already authorized. So how does he have any constitutional standing to abide by the debt limit?
Yes. So this is the classic paper on this is the Columbia Law Review paper, was very kind of talked about in the Obama White House. Buchanan and Dorff, a paper titled "Choosing the Least Unconstitutional Option," and their framing was exactly what you're talking about. That you have this spending obligation, and spending and taxing is Congress's prerogative. You can't impound things. That's the spending power, and then on top of that, there's the 1974 Impoundment Act, because Nixon tried to arbitrarily choose what to spend and what not to spend, and Congress passed an act specifically, making sure that that isn't a possibility, or trying to rule that out. You have a certain amount of authority to issue a certain amount of Treasury securities. You have a cap on that, so you have the debt ceiling, you have your spending obligation, and you have 14th Amendment, or just Section 1, Article 8 of the Constitution. The debts must be honored. So what do you do with that? Where you can't default, where spending and taxing is prerogative of Congress, and you have this cap of the debt ceiling. And so Buchanan and Dorff's answer is break the debt ceiling. That's the least unconstitutional option, is simply ignoring the debt ceiling law. Some other people argue that you can say that the debt ceiling is simply unconstitutional itself and is an invalid statute. They have
right.
Their
there's no. The only constitutional. There's nothing There's a problem insofar as that maybe the executive branch is ignoring the will of Congress in terms of the statute. But the debt ceiling, we should say, is the only one that of these directives that is not in the Constitution.
Yes.
And it could very well be contrary to the Constitution.
Yeah, so there's a constitutional obligation generally to follow statute, and so there's a debate. The only argument out of whether breaking through the debt ceiling is just affirmatively constitutional is if the debt ceiling itself is unconstitutional, would be ruled unconstitutional. The thing is that there's more financing authorities than just the debt ceiling. So the debt ceiling can be constitutional if you have alternative ways of financing spending, and thus, dealing with this potential mismatch between financing authority and spending obligation. And minting $1 trillion platinum coin is one of those financing options. They can mint $1 trillion platinum coin, deposit it at the Federal Reserve, make payments out of their bank account at the Fed, and that's the way that the debt ceiling would be consistent with the president's otherwise constitutional obligation.
Can you explain, just for folks who were not around 10 years ago when this became like a necessity to sort of develop this idea, what it is? Go ahead. The Treasury has the ability to mint money,
so the Treasury, mints coins all the time. Normally, the laws around coinage set the face value, meaning just like a penny is a penny, it's worth 1 cent. Quarter is 25 cents, $1, $1 coin, so on and so forth. Generally, the Congress is very tight with the denomination of the coins. An exception was Coinage Act in 1997, what's now in the U.S. Code section, U.S. Code section 31, section 5112K, says that it goes against that usual tradition. It says that the Treasury Secretary can direct for a platinum coin to be minted of any denomination as serves the needs of the United States. So it's completely unlimited discretion on the denomination. Now, of course, when they passed that act, they weren't thinking about these larger kind of macro budgetary questions. They wanted to just sell some commemorative coins, especially overseas. But the purpose was explicitly to get senior revenue for the United States. And they knew that they were opening the discretion. Philip Deal, the U.S. Mint director at the time, who wrote this, who co-wrote this and then found a Republican congressman to pass the bill with him, Mike Castle, he's an advocate for minting $1 trillion coin, says that it totally fits the original idea of why they were motivated to write the coin. They just didn't imagine this further step, which is, since it's legal tender, you can then go deposit it at the Federal Reserve, which is our banker. The technical phrase is fiscal agent, and they have an obligation to provide us payment services, which includes accepting deposits and making payments on our behalf. So the Fed is obligated to accept this legal tender when the Treasury proffers it on deposit, and then it fills up our bank account.
What was the biggest platinum coin that they've minted in the wake of that legislation?
I'd have to check. I think maybe like $500 or something, maybe $1,000. I have to check. I don't know.
How much money do they think they were going to raise on that?
It was a penny ante thing. You're hoping. I think it's was thinking in terms of the hundreds of millions.
Huh. All right. And so this authority,
it was quite successful program, very successful program. They sold a ton of them in Japan. Phil Deal knows his stuff.
There it is. We raised $200 million. I mean, it seems like it seems like not a lot of money in the grand scheme of things, but the authority exists there. And once you put it in the Fed, the Fed pays off basically, what does that do?
It's just like filling up your bank account. It increases the bank account. So there's the Treasury's bank account is called the Treasury General Account. It usually keeps $200 billion in there. Because of the debt ceiling, it's been running down that balance, and that would fill right up, and the Treasury would then start spending out of that account. They could, if they wanted to, then go out and buy more Treasury securities back, and get some further breathing room for the debt ceiling, or they could just sit on the funds and let the money roll down in their account as the U.S. deficit spends, as it was already on track to do, the same amount. It doesn't authorize any more spending. It's just financing the spending that's already been.
But you could buy back some of the debt too with it as well, right?
Absolutely. Just like they can buy back debt right now. Some people have suggested, with interest rates a lot higher, for the Treasury to engage in a big buyback, to buy back longer maturity debt, issue shorter maturity debt, and buy themselves a little breathing room with the debt ceiling. The idea
is we're gonna just buy a bunch of CDs. In consumer parlance, I guess, go out and get whatever percentage. And what is the fear associated with this?
I think the fear is two things. I think the main thing is just the ridiculousness factor. It sounds ridiculous. There's nothing centrist Democrats hate more than looking foolish, even though they look really foolish right now. This type of sort of doing something unconventional, the Keynes quote about how, most people would rather fail conventionally than succeed unconventionally. There's just a sense that inherently you're going to do something ridiculous. make you look ridiculous. And even if it were actually to cut off this debt ceiling fight, that you would lose politically from the embarrassment that you did some silly thing and, made the U.S. a laughing stock.
The stupidest thing that I've heard about all of this is that this is actually like anything other, like to the extent that there is any price to pay politically in any of this, it is completely manufactured by the people trying to avoid paying a price politically. The general population only hears that there's some type of like debt crisis in the same way that there's like a hurricane that is coming. Yeah. And the idea that like, we would have an ability to sort of like, we also happen to have a hurricane zapping device that can eliminate the hurricane. Yes, we reported the other day that there was a Hurricane 5 that was about to hit New Orleans, and actually we deployed the hurricane zapping device. End of story. Move on to the next story. Nobody cares. Nobody cares, it seems like, except for in some sort of a parallel universe. Like
Beltway media, centrist writers. I mean, that's the constituency that they're appealing to with this.
It's stunning. It's stunning to me.
I mean, a lot of people genuinely believe that you mint $1 trillion coin, $1 trillion platinum coin, and you deposit it at the Fed and payments start going out, and Americans will realize that money is fake and they will lose all confidence in the dollar. They will then go on a spending spurge that causes hyperinflation. I've had serious conversations. I have been in rooms with former Federal Reserve officials where this kind of conversation happens. Like the elite people who have either in the past or currently actually involved in real governmental decisions believe this kind of thing.
They also believe it kind of relative to student debt, right? Where it's like, well, if people realize that debt can just be eliminated, what does that say for other kinds of debts?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, people, they genuinely, there are people who really believe this stuff who have made consequential governmental decisions in the last 30, 40 years.
What does this mean about for the 14th Amendment, though? Because I'm very confused when just going back to Biden's negotiations here. He kind of came out and said, I'm considering it. And we all thought that was BS, right? Because it's completely not in his nature. Now he's just saying, oh, it would take too long. But why a few weeks ago was he publicly discussing the possibility of the 14th Amendment? And can you flesh out a little bit more of what that option might look like if, it were to happen, which we now know it's not going to?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's a few things there. One is a proper legal analysis is that even invoking the 14th Amendment means doing something like minting the coin or issuing bonds. There's this whole other weird thing we can talk about, which is the debt ceiling applies to the face value of the debt. So if you issue debt that have big coupons, meaning they offer a lot of interest, but the face value is low, and then you offer them at auction and people buy them, they buy them for 5% interest, and that ends up meaning they're paying way above face value, then you can sort of get around the debt ceiling. And this is, this is some other different gimmick that some people like more, including some centrists. Like Josh Barrow likes that gimmick better than he likes the coin. And so regardless, whether it's the weird bonds or the coin, invoking the 14th Amendment is doing those things because you have to do the most constitutional thing first. And the most constitutional thing first is one of those options. Now, if you ignored all the sort of workaround type things, there are others I could mention, which are even more obscure. It's not worth talking about. Then the other option would simply just be issue treasury debt. Just like follow the same auction schedule that they already were following. Just keep on issuing, and they would have more treasury securities outstanding than the cap, than the debt ceiling cap, and they're essentially just ignoring the debt ceiling.
Right. You just pretend like that law doesn't. I've gone to the Office of Legal Counsel, at the DOJ. They've said this law is actually unconstitutional. If you follow this law, you will be you'll be breaking the Constitution, and that's it. And their whole argument about we need this to be resolved quickly is sort of belied by the fact that they're not allowing the court case that's taking place in Boston right now to do that function. But I think it gets back to what you said earlier, which is to the extent that there's maliciousness here, and I would argue that your assessment of that is right in that instance, is that they're okay with some cuts. It's not their agenda, but they're okay with some cuts because the important thing is they think that this has more political value to them than actually doing the thing that would resolve the problem in a more efficient way. It's insane. Nathan Tankus, I want to bring you back to talk a little bit about inflation too, particularly as this sort of like notion of maybe it was in fact that these huge profits contributed to inflation. But thanks so much for your time. We will put a link to your newsletter that folks should be reading on a daily basis. Thanks so much, Nathan.
Thank you very much.